virtues, and character formation. Many of the short passages from the Analects and the Thicket of Sayings passages excavated at Guodian describe the development of set of ideal behaviors associated with the moral ideal of the way Dao of the gentleman junzi. Based on the analogy between the way of Confucius and character ethics systems deriving from Aristotle, these patterns of behavior are today often described using the Latinate term virtue. In the second passage in the Analects, the disciple You Ruo says a person who behaves with filial piety to parents and siblings xiao and die, and who avoids going against superiors, will rarely disorder society. It relates this correlation to a more general picture of how patterns of good behavior effectively open up the possibility of following the way of the gentleman. The gentleman works at the roots. Once the roots are established, the way comes to life. The way of the gentleman is a distillation of the exemplary behaviors of the selfless culture heroes of the past, and is available to all who are willing to work at the roots. In this way, the virtues that Confucius taught were not original to him, but represented his adaptations of existing cultural ideals, to which he continually returned in order to clarify their proper expressions in different situations. 5 behaviors of the gentleman most central to the Analects are benevolence ren, righteousness yai, ritual propriety lai, wisdom ji, and trustworthiness xin. The virtue of benevolence entails interacting with others guided by a sense of what is good from their perspectives. Sometimes the Analects defines benevolence generally as caring for others, but in certain contexts it is associated with more specific behaviors. Examples of contextual definitions of benevolence include treating people on the street as important guests and common people as if they were attendants at a sacrifice, being reticent in speaking and rejecting the use of clever speech, and being respectful where one dwells, reverent where one works, and loyal where one deals with others. It is the broadest of the virtues, yet a gentleman would rather die than compromise it. Benevolence entails a kind of unselfishness, or, as David Hall and Roger Ames suggest, it involves forming moral judgments from a combined perspective of self and others. Later writers developed accounts of the sources of benevolent behavior, most famously in the context of the discussion of human nature, seen in the centuries after Confucius. Mencius, 4th century BCE, argued that benevolence grows out of the cultivation of an effective disposition to compassion seen in the face of another's distress. The anonymous author of the late Warring States period excavated text 5 Kins of Action Wu Singh describes it as building from the affection one feels for close family members, through successive stages to finally develop into a more universal, fully fledged virtue. In the Analects, however, one comment on human nature emphasizes the importance of nurture. By nature people are close, by habituation they are miles apart, a sentiment that suggests the importance of training one's dispositions through ritual and the classics in a manner closer to the program of Xunzi, 3rd century BCE. The Analects, however, discusses the incubation of benevolent behavior in family and ritual contexts. You Ruo winds up his discussion of the roots of the way of the gentleman with the rhetorical question, is not behaving with filial piety to one's parents and siblings the root of benevolence? Confucius tells his disciple Yan Yuan that benevolence is a matter of overcoming oneself and returning to ritual propriety. These connections between benevolence and other virtues underscore the way in which benevolent behavior does not entail creating novel social forms or relationships, but is grounded in traditional familial and ritual networks. The second virtue, righteousness, is often described in the Analects relative to situations involving public responsibility. In contexts where standards of fairness and integrity are valuable, such as acting as the steward of an estate, as some of the disciples of Confucius did, righteousness is what keeps a person uncorrupted. Confucius wrote that a gentleman thinks of righteousness when faced with gain, or when faced with profit. Confucius says that one should ignore the wealth and rank one might attain by acting against righteousness, even if it means eating coarse rice, drinking water, and sleeping using one's bent arm as a pillow. Later writers like Junzi celebrated Confucius for his righteousness in office, which he stressed was all the more impressive because Confucius was extremely poor Wangba. This behavior is particularly relevant in official interactions with ordinary people, such as when employing common people. And if a social superior has mastered it, the common people will all comply. Like benevolence, righteousness also entails unselfishness, but instead of coming out of consideration for the needs of others, it is rooted in steadfastness in the face of temptation. The perspective needed to act in a righteous way is sometimes related to an attitude to personal profit that recalls the previous section's discussion of how Confucius taught his disciples to recalibrate their sense of value based on their immersion in the sacrificial system. More specifically, evaluating things based on their ritual significance can put one at odds with conventional hierarchies of value. This is defined as the root of righteous behavior in a story from the late Warring States period text Master Fei of Hanhan Faisi. The tale relates how at court, Confucius was given a plate with a peach and a pile of millet grains with which to scrub the fruit clean. After the attendants laughed at Confucius for proceeding to eat the millet first, Confucius explained to them that in sacrifices to the former kings, millet itself is the most valued offering. Therefore, cleaning a ritually base peach with millet would be obstructing righteousness, and so I dared not put the peach above what fills the vessels in the ancestral shrine. Waichu Shuo Zuo Shang. While such stories may have been told to mock his fastidiousness, for Confucius the essence of righteousness was internalizing a system of value that he would breach for neither convenience nor profit. At times, the phrase benevolence and righteousness is used metonymically for all the virtues, but in some later texts, a benevolent impulse to compassion and a righteous steadfastness are seen as potentially contradictory. In the Analects, portrayals of Confucius do not recognize a tension between benevolence and righteousness, perhaps because each is usually described as salient in a different set of contexts. In ritual contexts, like courts or shrines, one ideally acts like one might act out of familial affection in a personal context, the paradigm that is key to benevolence. In the performance of official duties, one ideally acts out of the responsibilities felt to inferiors and superiors, with a resistance to temptation by corrupt gain that is key to righteousness. The records of ritual distinguishes between the domains of these two virtues. In regulating one's household, kindness overrules righteousness. Outside of one's house, righteousness cuts off kindness. What one undertakes in serving one's father, one also does in serving one's Lord, because one's reverence for both is the same. Treating nobility in a noble way and the honorable in an honorable way is the height of righteousness. Sangfu Shiji. While it is not the case that righteousness is benevolence by other means, this passage underlines how in different contexts, different virtues may push people toward participation in particular shared cultural practices constitutive of the good life. While the virtues of benevolence and righteousness might impel a gentleman to adhere to ritual norms in particular situations or areas of life, a third virtue of ritual propriety expresses a sensitivity to one's social place and willingness to play all of one's multiple ritual roles. The term lay translated here as ritual propriety has a particularly wide range of connotations, and additionally connotes both the conventions of ritual and etiquette. In the Analects, Confucius is depicted both teaching and conducting the rites in the manner that he believed they were conducted in antiquity. Detailed restrictions, such as the gentleman avoids wearing garments with red-black trim, which the poet Ezra Pound disparaged as verses re length of the nightgown and the predilection for ginger, were by no means trivial to Confucius. His imperative, do not look or listen, speak or move, unless it is in accordance with the rites, in answer to a question about benevolence, illustrates how the symbolic conventions of the ritual system played a role in the cultivation of the virtues. We have seen how ritual shapes values by restricting desires, thereby allowing reflection and the cultivation of moral dispositions. Yet without the proper affective state, a person is not properly performing ritual. In the Analects, Confucius says he cannot tolerate ritual without reverence or mourning without grief. When asked about the root of ritual propriety, he says that in funerals, the mourner's distress is more important than the formalities. Knowing the details of ritual protocols is important, but is not a substitute for sincere effect in performing them. Together, they are necessary conditions for the gentleman's training, and are also essential to understanding the social context in which Confucius taught his disciples. The mastery that ritual propriety signaled was part of a curriculum associated with the training of rulers and officials, and proper ritual performance at court could also serve as a kind of political legitimation. Confucius summarized the different prongs of the education in ritual and music involved in the training of his followers. Raise yourself up with the classic of odes. Establish yourself with ritual. Complete yourself with music. On one occasion, Bo Yu, the son of Confucius, explained that when he asked his father to teach him, his father told him to study the classic of odes in order to have a means to speak with others and to study ritual to establish himself. That Confucius insists that his son master classical literature and practices underscores the values of these cultural products as a means of transmitting the way from one generation to the next. He tells his disciples that the study of the classic of odes prepares them for different aspects of life, providing them with a capacity to, at home, serve one's father, away from it, serve one's lord, as well as increase one's knowledge of the names of birds, animals, plants, and trees. This valuation of knowledge of both the cultural and natural worlds is one reason why the figure of Confucius has traditionally been identified with schooling, and why today his birthday is celebrated as Teacher's Day in some parts of Asia. In the ancient world, this kind of education also qualified Confucius and his disciples for employment on estates and at courts. The fourth virtue, wisdom, is related to appraising people and situations. In the Analects, wisdom allows a gentleman to discern crooked and straight behavior in others and discriminate between those who may be reformed and those who may not. In the former dialogue, Confucius explains the virtue of wisdom as knowing others. The Thicket of Sayings excavated at Guodian indicates that this knowledge is the basis for properly selecting others, defining wisdom as the virtue that is the basis for selection. But it is also about appraising situations correctly, as suggested by the master's rhetorical question, how can a person be considered wise if that person does not dwell in benevolence? One well-known passage often cited to imply Confucius is agnostic about the world of the spirits is more literally about how wisdom allows an outsider to present himself in a way appropriate to the people on whose behalf he is working. When working for what is right for the common people, to show reverence for the ghosts and spirits while maintaining one's distance may be deemed wisdom. The context for this sort of appraisal is usually official service, and wisdom is often attributed to valued ministers or advisors to sage rulers. In certain dialogues, wisdom also connotes a moral discernment that allows the gentleman to be confident of the appropriateness of good actions. In the Analects, Confucius tells his disciple Zilu that wisdom recognizes knowing a thing as knowing it, and ignorance of a thing as ignorance of it. In soliloquies about several virtues, Confucius describes a wise person as never confused. While comparative philosophers have noted that Chinese thought has nothing clearly analogous to the role of the will in pre-modern European philosophy, the moral discernment that is part of wisdom does provide actors with confidence that the moral actions they have taken are correct. The virtue of trustworthiness qualifies a gentleman to give advice to a ruler, and a ruler or official to manage others. In the Analects, Confucius explains it succinctly: if one is trustworthy, others will give one responsibilities. While trustworthiness may be rooted in the proper expression of friendship between those of the same status, it is also valuable in interactions with those of different status. The disciple Xiao explains its effect on superiors and subordinates. When advising a ruler without trustworthiness, the ruler will think a gentleman is engaged in slander, and when administering a state without trustworthiness, people will think a gentleman is exploiting them. The implication is that a sincerely public-minded official would be ineffective without the trust that this quality inspires. In a dialogue with a ruler from Chapter 4 of Han's intertextual commentary, The Odes, Confucius explains that in employing someone, trustworthiness is superior to strength, ability to flatter, or eloquence. Being able to rely on someone is so important to Confucius that, when asked about good government, he explained that trustworthiness was superior to either food or weapons, concluding if the people do not find the ruler trustworthy, the state will not stand. By the Han period, benevolence, righteousness, ritual propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness began to be considered as a complete set of human virtues, corresponding with other quintets of phenomena used to describe the natural world. Some texts described a level of moral perfection, as with the sages of antiquity, as unifying all these virtues. Prior to this, it is unclear whether the possession of a particular virtue entailed having all the others, although benevolence was sometimes used as a more general term for a combination of one or more of the other virtues. At other times, Confucius presented individual virtues as expressions of goodness in particular domains of life. Early Confucius dialogues are embedded in concrete situations, and so resist attempts to distill them into more abstract principles of morality. As a result, descriptions of the virtues are embedded in anecdotes about the exemplary individuals whose character traits the dialogues encourage their audience to develop. Confucius taught that the measure of a good action was whether it was an expression of the actor's virtue, something his lessons share with those of philosophies like Aristotle's that are generally described as virtue ethics. A modern evaluation of the teachings of Confucius as a virtue ethics is articulated in Brian W. Van Norden's Virtue Ethics and Consequentialism in Early Chinese Philosophy, which pays particular attention to analogies between the way of Confucius and Aristotle's good life. The nature of the available source materials about Confucius, however, means that the diverse texts from early China lack the systematization of a work like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. The 5 virtues described above are not the only ones of which Confucius spoke. He discussed loyalty zong, which at one point is described as the minister's behavior toward a ritually proper ruler. He said that courage yong is what compels one to act once one has seen where righteousness lies. Another term, sometimes translated as virtue di, is usually used to describe the authority of a ruler that grows out of goodness or favor to others, and is a key term in many of the social and political works discussed in the following section. Yet going through a list of all the virtues in the early sources is not sufficient to describe the entirety of the moral universe associated with Confucius. The presence of themes in the Analects like the ruler's exceptional influence as a moral exemplar, the importance of judging people by their deeds rather than their words, or even the protection of the culture of xiao by higher powers, all highlight the unsystematic nature of the text and underscore that teaching others how to cultivate the virtues is a key aspect, but only a part, of the ethical ideal of Confucius. Yet there is also a conundrum inherent in any attempt to derive abstract moral rules from the mostly dialogical form of the Analects, that is, the problem of whether the situational context and conversation partner is integral to evaluating the statements of Confucius. A historically notable example of an attempt to find a generalized moral rule in the Analects is the reading of a pair of passages that use a formulation similar to that of the Golden Rule of the Christian Bible to describe benevolence: do not impose upon others those things that you yourself do not desire. Read as axiomatic moral imperatives, these passages differ from the kind of exemplar-based and situational conversations about morality usually found in the Analects. For this reason, some scholars, including E. Bruce Brooks, believe these passages to be interpolations. While they are not wholly inconsistent with the way that benevolence is described in early texts, their interpretation as abstract principles has been influenced by their perceived similarity to the biblical examples. In the records of ritual, a slightly different formulation of a rule about self and others is presented as not universal in its scope, but rather as descriptive of how the exemplary ruler influences the people. In common with other early texts, the Analects describes how the moral transformation of society relies on the positive example of the ruler, comparing the influence of the gentleman on the people to the way the wind blows on the grass, forcing it to bend. In a similar vein, after discussing how the personal qualities of rulers of the past determined whether or not their subjects could morally transform, the Records of Ritual expresses its principle of reflexivity. That is why the gentleman only seeks things in others that he or she personally possesses. The gentleman only condemns things in others that he or she personally lacks. Daxu. This is a point about the efficacy of moral suasion, saying that a ruler cannot expect to reform society solely by command, since it is only the ruler's personal example that can transform others. For this reason, the ruler should not compel behaviors from his subjects to which he or she would not personally assent, something rather different from the Golden Rule. Historically, however, views that Confucius was inspired by the same natural theology as Christians, or that philosophers are naturally concerned with the generalization of moral imperatives, have argued in favor of a closer identification with the Golden Rule, a fact that illustrates the interpretative conundrum arising from the formal aspects of the Analects. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts or any questions you have. Your feedback helps us create better content for you. See you in the next video.